Well, thanks very much for inviting me to give this lecture. It's a real honour and a privilege. I knew Aidan Halligan a bit. He was Deputy Chief Medical Officer in England when I was appointed Chief Medical Officer in Scotland. A man of great charm and gentleness, and I was very saddened to hear he'd been taken from us when he still had so much to give. So I'm grateful for the invitation to speak in his memory. Now, I want to start off this talk on epidemics of despair because I believe that's what we're seeing in a number of countries just now. I want to start off with a declaration of interest, or rather, more accurately, a declaration of no interest. I have absolutely no interest in politics. I've never been a member of a political party, and in the course of this talk, I'm probably going to insult all of them equally, okay? But there is no question that we can't talk about this topic without getting involved in the politics of poverty. And over the years, I've concluded that one of the major problems we have in addressing issues of poverty is this notion of the undeserving poor. The first written references I could find to the undeserving poor goes back to ancient Rome. Beggars used to line up at the gates of Rome, and citizens would come in and they'd ask, "Are you a citizen of Rome?" And if you were, you were given money. And if you weren't a citizen of Rome, you weren't given money. Now, we would never be crass enough 2,000 years later to deny people help on the basis of their nationality, would we? Then in the early Christian writing, there were some writers that said things like, well, we shouldn't give money to the poor because it will encourage them in bad behaviour, like drunkenness and prostitution. Actually, you still hear that today. Oh, I don't give them money, they'll just spend it on drink. Well, whose business is that? Give them the damn money. Then you find later on guys like this. This guy, Joseph Townsend, was a Church of England cleric. He was also a medical doctor. And were he alive today, he'd probably be working for the Department of Work and Pensions. It is only hunger which can spur and goad the poor on to labour. That mentality is still alive and well in our society. Now, I would have to say, as a medical graduate of Glasgow University, I'm delighted to tell you that Joseph Townsend was a medical graduate of Edinburgh University. Margaret Thatcher famously said that poverty was a personality defect. I felt, before quoting that, I had to go and chase up the original quote, and this is the original quote in a newspaper interview. Nowadays, there is really no primary poverty in our country. Yeah? Okay. There may be poverty because some people don't know how to budget, how to spend their earnings. But now you're left with the really hard fundamental character of poverty, personality defect. And she went on to say that, for example, drug addiction is a personality defect that causes poverty. And in doing so, she was guilty of reverse causality, because poverty actually probably causes the drug addiction, or at least the interaction is very complex. So what we have are politicians who completely oversimplify the problem and jump to conclusions depending on where they're coming from on the political spectrum. The Guardian, a few years ago, talked about, suddenly poverty is not about not having money, it's the result of lifestyle choices. And the government has finally has succeeded in redefining poverty as no longer simply about not having enough money. So we have this belief out there about rational economic man. We choose to be poor. That's still out there. The economists that run the world through GDP, which takes no account of well-being of people or of the environment, still believe that people make choices about whether or not they're going to be poor. The guy that I like to quote most is this chap here, a Catholic priest who 30 years ago was sent to the parish of South Central Los Angeles, where he was to look after the most violent Latino population in the United States. He told me once that when he arrived, he went to the house he was given and he put his bag in and he went out, decided to go and walk round the parish. And he'd gone about 100 yards down this street and a police car stopped him and said, "Father, if you go down here, you'll be dead in 10 minutes. These guys mean business and they don't like authority figures here." Greg made friends with them. He asked them what they needed in life, and what they needed was purpose, meaning. And meaning came from running drugs and fighting. So he got this guy, a friend of his who's a film producer, to buy him a disused bakery. And he started a company called Homeboy Bakeries. And he's probably given work and sustenance to about 4,000 families over those years. Transformed lives. And he visits Glasgow periodically. And I take him around schools, and this is what he tells the school kids. What we need is a compassion that stands in awe at the burdens the poor have to carry, rather than one that stands in judgment at the way they carry them. That's a pretty good riposte to the people who say that poverty is a lifestyle choice. If you were in their position, would you be any different? I may say that after starting Homeboy Bakeries, Greg told me that he had to quickly start a second company because he was into the business a week or two, and this guy came in, sat down and said, "Greg, I really need your help. I'm desperate to get a job. I've been going to interview after interview, and no one will take me seriously." And Greg said, I looked at him and he had all sorts of piercings, but one's eye was drawn to a tattoo, one of the many tattoos he had, and tattooed across his forehead was 3 words in large letters: "Fuck the world." So Greg said, "I think I know what your problem is." So he then got a plastic surgeon friend of his to bring a laser along, and he started Homeboy tattoo removals. So it's that kind of guy, is just fix the problem. And that's the theme of what I'm going to say. There's a problem out there. Why the hell aren't we fixing it? So I want to talk about Scotland's epidemic of despair. In Scotland, we're constantly told by the likes of the Daily Mail and so on that we're a basket case when it comes to health. We're desperately unhealthy. We're unhealthy because we drink too much, we smoke too much, we eat the wrong kind of food, and if only we'd get a grip, everything would be okay. That's how people conceptualize health. Actually, only one of those statements is true, and regrettably, it's the one about the drink. But anyway, is Scotland an unhealthy country? Well, this slide shows life expectancy trends in 16 Western European countries going back 160 years. The data goes back to 1851. You see the impact of life expectancy in Europe of the Second World War, the First World War, and so on. And you can see that for most of that time, Scottish life expectancy is about the average, except for the past 5-6 decades, when we've drifted to the back of the pack. And if you look at the rate of growth in life expectancy in the richest 20% of the population, that's what's happened. Affluent people are doing pretty well in terms of life expectancy in Scotland. That's the rate of growth of life expectancy in the poorest 20% of the population. Scotland's poor average health is a reflection of the fact that the poor people have not gained as much life expectancy over the past 50 years as the rich. Scotland's poor health is a reflection of the poor. And it's not cigarettes. This is smoking rates in 15-year-old teenagers across the countries of Europe. Scottish teenagers are the 5th lowest smokers in this country. All these countries with higher life expectancies than us have higher teenage smoking rates. Scottish men, 3rd lowest smokers in Europe in this study, beaten only by the Finns and the Swedes. Scottish women are closer to the European average, but we're not where we are because we're the heaviest smokers. What about diet? Well, the yellow line there is heart disease mortality in Finnish men. And you can see in the 60s, Finnish men had very high heart disease mortality. So the Finnish government decided that this problem was diet. We eat too much fat, they said. So they took subsidies away from dairy farmers to discourage them from producing milk, butter, cream, cheese, thereby making the Finns the most miserable people in Europe. And they gave them the subsidies back if they'd switched to growing fruit and vegetables. And I once asked the director of the Finnish Institute of Public Health, how did you do this? And he said, well, Finnish Institute of Public Health told the Finnish government what to do, the Finnish government told the Finnish people what to do, and the Finnish people did it. I said, well, that's Scotland's stuff, because we never do anything anyone tells us. But you see the fall in heart disease that followed the change in diet. But the problem with concluding that the change in diet caused the fall in heart disease is that that pale green line alongside the yellow line is the Scottish heart disease mortality. The Finns took radical action to change their diet. The Scots invented the deep-fried Mars bar, and it didn't make any difference. They both saw the same sort of fall in heart disease, and the reason is that in the 1960s was the decade that men gave up smoking in huge numbers. And every high-income country has seen similar falls in heart disease mortality. So we jump to conclusions. We oversimplify cause and effect. Oh, it must be diet. Oh, it must be smoking. It's all these things acting together, plus several other things. So a colleague of mine decided to try and work out what was driving this inequality. And the results were surprising. This, for example, what he did was he split the population up into 5-year age bands, men and women. And for each age band, they plotted mortality according to wealth. So here on the left-hand side, you see annual mortality in men over the age of 65 in the richest 20% of the population, and it goes down all the way to the poorest 20% of the population that are, more than twice as likely to die. He then reduced all the data on that slide to a single number, which reflects the slope of mortality, by subtracting the best from the worst and dividing by the mean. So you come up with a single number that represents how steep the inequality curve is. You can then plot those numbers, and you see that the steepness of the inequality curve shoots up age 10 to 15. It's at its highest in the 30s and starts to come down in the 40s and 50s. Those aren't the people who are dying of heart disease and cancer. And he went on to prove that. What he did was he took individual causes of death, and here we've got heart disease, 5-year age band, slope index of inequality, 5-year age bands, and you plot that on the graph, and that's how heart disease contributes to inequality in the Scottish population. It hardly contributes at all. And where it does contribute, it's after the peak. It's when things are beginning to fall. So if it's not heart disease and cancer, what's causing it? Well, it's suicide, drugs, alcohol, and violence. Not things we're going to fix by reducing the saturated fat content of the diet. Something happened in the 50s and 60s that began to change the dynamics of the population and saw widening inequality coming in amongst younger people. And we now know this data is more than 15 years old now, and we can see that peak moving through the population. So what happened in the 60s and so on? Well, 20 miles on either side of the Clyde in the 1950s, that's what you'd see at 5 o'clock on any weekday. Hundreds of thousands of men who built great ships. You had a sense of purpose and meaning if you were a welder or a riveter in the shipyards. And those jobs began to disappear. And by the 70s, they were more or less gone. And at the same time as the heavy industry jobs in the west of Scotland were going, never to be replaced adequately, the housing began to change. The housing that was built in the 19th century in places like the Gorbals and so on was no longer fit for purpose. Sanitation, shared toilets and so on, no longer adequate. But what you had there was a community. This is a picture of the Gorbals in the 19th century. There you've got a community. You've got adults, you've got children playing in the street. The adults are keeping an eye on the street. They're helping each other. You've got areas like this, Bridget Cross, where there was civic space where people would come together and meet each other. And, New Year's Eve, it was like chaos, in places like that. But that was part of the community. People looked after each other. The women in that community were the glue that helped new mothers who were having difficulty bringing up children. They looked after each other. And then in the 50s and 60s, the city engineer, a man called Robert Bruce, came up with a master plan. He was going to knock everything down and build these. Something that was later described as filing cabinets for people. And people who'd lived close to each other were spread throughout the west of Scotland as the new town idea came about. So the friends that you'd lived beside for 10, 20 years, you never saw again. And you were sent out to a place called Easterhouse, maybe, where there were 2 shops and a pub and no school and poor transport to get to any jobs that might be available. So we had poverty that came about through loss of work, and we had fracturing of social cohesion. And what we've seen emerging are these deaths from drugs, alcohol, suicide, and violence. Now, what we have seen recently is reports of exactly the same thing happening in the United States. 2 economists at Princeton, one Nobel Prize winner called Angus Deaton, point to the fact that men in their 50s in the United States, this is mortality amongst white, non-Hispanic men in their 50s. When the same group in countries like Germany, France, Sweden is declining, places like Canada and Australia, it's going up slightly, UK there, a lot of that will be driven by Scotland. Huge increases in deaths from drugs, alcohol, and suicide in men in their 50s. And if you look at the places, this is mortality rates. Black is the highest mortality. You can see it's happening in the Midwest, and it's happening in the former Rust Belt areas of Pennsylvania and so on. It's the places where industry has gone, where blue-collar workers without higher education are feeling lost. They've lost security, they've lost pensions, they've lost health care, and it's only getting worse. And politically, people are turning to populist parties. Fascist parties in Germany and Poland and so on, extremist parties. God knows how you would describe Trump. But, people are turning away from conventional parties, and the world is getting a more uncertain and dangerous place. Our explanation in Scotland, and I don't yet know, and I think I need to talk to the American researchers about this, but we looked at what is maybe causing an intergenerational problem, because where fathers lost jobs, they began to turn to drink, they began to turn to drugs, you would get domestic violence, you would get homelessness. Where children are being brought up in chaotic circumstances, there are very significant impacts on the child's future prospects. An American study called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, or ACEs as it's known for shorthand, looked at 9 different types of adverse event in the lives of children. Types of abuse, types of neglect, parental substance misuse, domestic violence, parental mental illness, a parent being in jail, parental absence generally. What they discovered was that 4 or more adverse events in a child's life meant that child was 8 times more likely to become an alcoholic than children who experienced no adverse events, 11 times more likely to become narcotics abusers. Boys who experience physical violence at the hands of an older male, 8 times more likely to engage in partner violence when they grew up, 4 or 5 times more likely to have been arrested for carrying weapons. That's the pattern of ill health that the ACEs study showed in this Californian population. Slight increases in risk of cancer and heart disease, but substantial increases in risk of death from suicide, drugs, alcohol, and so on. That's the pattern of excess mortality we see in Glasgow. It's the same. So these emerging patterns of premature death and inequality seem to be closely associated with what's happening in other countries. We need a solution. So what I talk about is this intergenerational cycle of alienation. Kids who experience chaotic early years, and I don't have time to go into the biology of this, but the brains of children who experience inconsistency, threat, domestic violence, upregulate stress response, and it upregulates their tendency to behave badly. They tend to get violent when stressed. So these kids develop what are seen as mental health problems, behavioral problems. They go to school, they're difficult to manage. Schools have in the past, and probably still do, exclude them for bad behavior. What has been happening? They're excluded from school, they go down the shopping centre, they get their hands on some cheap vodka, they get into a fight, they go to jail. And I go to jail quite often to talk to them, and most of the time they let me out. And I say, okay, John, you're getting out in 2 weeks' time. What are you going to do when you get out? Oh, I'll never get a job. I've got a criminal record. Well, what are you going to do? Oh, I'll sit at home, I'll watch telly, and I'll drink. They have lost a sense of self-efficacy. They've lost any sense of self-control. They've lost any sense of agency. Other people are telling them what to do. But the one thing they don't factor in at that stage is the fact that the girlfriend will have a baby or two, and that baby is brought up in chaotic circumstances. So we decided that we were going to try and break that cycle by tackling early years problems, tackling ACEs, and Scotland has embarked on a programme of doing that with very powerful ministerial commitment to it, although, as I say, it's not ministers that are going to make the difference, it's people that are going to make the difference in all of this. So how do we change this? How do we create well-being in circumstances that erode it and damage it and remove it from people's psychological makeup? Well, I came across this term salutogenesis. Doctors learn about pathogenesis, the causes of pathology, the causes of disease. So we focus hugely on this. You know, a disease has a cause, so find the cause and you can fix the disease. Salus was the Roman goddess of well-being and safety. So salutogenesis is the creation of well-being, and there are about 25 different theories on this slide as to how you create well-being. And you'll be pleased to know that I'm going to go through them all one by one. Yeah, okay. One slide, okay. You can distill out from those 25 different theories themes that say that people are well if they have an optimistic outlook on life, if they have that sense of control, and that sense of control is within them. I make decisions about my life, not these people out there. If they have a sense of purpose and meaning in life, if they feel that they can respond to problems, if they don't run away from problems, but they say, right, I'll fix this. And usually that comes from having a supportive network of people round about them, and the basis of it is having had a nurturing family. Maslow, psychologist, came up with Maslow's hierarchy of human need. And what he said was, once you've got access to food and water, the next level that you need to be able to fully realize your life is security, employment, resources, a home, a place to sleep at night, a place that you feel confident that you're going to wake up in the morning. Once you've got that, you can get up into these areas that people expect you to have. Decision-making, a sense of self-esteem, confidence, respect of others, and respect for others. And yet, what we do is we judge people on this basis who have no security down here. It doesn't make any kind of scientific sense. And people come to this kind of thing with political prejudices. On the one hand, at one end of the political spectrum, this is all about social justice. At the other end of the spectrum, well, it's all about the decisions they make in life. I must say, I think Maslow, probably if were he alive today, would put another layer at the bottom there. What's even more important than breathing is having access to Wi-Fi, but we'll get that. A couple of years ago, I went over to New York to meet the people who ran the 100,000 Homes campaign. That was their manifesto. The time has come to stop managing homelessness and start ending it. What they did was they just went out and ended it. They got volunteers in different towns and cities who found out where empty homes were, found a bit of money that was lying around in various pots, and they went out and they woke up rough sleepers. And Roseanne, who ran this project, told me that they had a triage form. So they would ask people, do you have any chronic disease? Have you ever had frostbite? You're diabetic or whatever. But she said the single most important question they asked was the first one. What's your name? Having asked that, it stopped being a technical exercise. It became personal. And the volunteers were seized by the fact, well, this is Fred. If only we can help Fred. He's got a family back east that he might be able to get in touch. And they moved heaven and earth for Fred. Not for the guy who slept under the bridge who used to have, who was diabetic. It became personal. And that's the basis on which we have to change society. What she said, as part of their manifesto, the solution to homelessness is apparent. Most communities have no clear, intentionally developed process for moving homeless people to permanent housing quickly. Forms, applications, and interviews produce stress and delay. That's true across the whole public sector in Britain. We have a public sector that's obsessed with rules and regulations and forms. And those forms don't exist to protect the citizen. They exist to protect the organisation. Because we have a culture that says, whatever you do, be efficient. Tony Blair's new public management with targets and indicators and so on cut across any ethos of public service, of serving the citizen. Cormac Russell of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute says, needs assessment directs funding to professionals and services. Because needs assessment says, oh, there's a lot of need out there, you need to give us money to meet that need. It's about the organisation. And then after you've got an individual that says, I know what you need, that's not the way to fix this. What we have at the moment is a provider who looks for needs and provides services, a citizen who says, I have needs, and it's their job to provide those services. Where we need to get to is this box in the middle, where citizens are confident in their own strengths and their own abilities and their ability to suck support in as they need it. What matters to the citizen is more important than what the organisation believes the citizen needs. So, fixing poverty. Just give money to the poor. It's easy. That fixes it. But all sorts of things get in the way. So we've started talking in Scotland about universal basic income. 4 counties have undertaken to introduce pilots. And that's based on evidence from Canada and America. And I also want to mention something about the Broadway project in London. The Mincombe project in Canada reduced domestic violence, produced better mental health, better child health. Hospitalizations were down 9%, saving money. Some of the American projects, high school graduations in the families that got minimum income up 30%. Low birth weight babies fell dramatically, stillbirth rate fell dramatically in the town of Gary, Indiana, where it was predicted that if you give these women money, they'll spend it on alcohol. Lo and behold, they spent it on food when they were pregnant. Surprise, surprise. The one thing, Richard Nixon actually had a bill ready to go to Congress to introduce universal basic income across the whole of the United States, and it was torpedoed by the report that in Seattle, divorces increased by 50%. And what was said was, this is what happens when you make women financially independent. They walk away from their husbands. So the whole thing was torpedoed. And then 10 years later, someone went and got the data out and found it was fake news. There was no impact on the divorce rate at all. It was invented to torpedo this bill. Big business decided it wasn't in their interest. And that's where we still are. The 1% are pulling the strings for the rest of us. In the light of that project, John Kenneth Galbraith, with another 1,200 economists in the United States, signed a letter to the New York Times that said, this country will not have met its responsibilities until everyone in the nation is guaranteed an income no less than the officially recognized definition of poverty. This is America we're talking about. Why aren't we doing it here? Evelyn Forget, the Canadian person who went back and got the Mincom data out and has made it more publicly accessible, concluded the political right is afraid people will stop working and the left doesn't trust them to make their own choices. This business about if you give people money, since I wrote an article in one of the Scottish newspapers about universal basic income, and folk that I thought were quite sensible said, oh, you give them money, they'll just sit and watch telly all day. Bollocks. There is no evidence of that. What happened in America was men reduced their working hours by 3%, mainly because they were taking additional courses to get better jobs. And women reduced their working hours by 9% for childcare, both of which contribute to society. Broadway Experiment, another example, where 13 rough sleepers with between a 4 and 45-year history of rough sleeping, pretty impressive, had cost the borough, the City of London, about £1 million, they reckoned, previously. They decided to give all 13 of them a bank account and a mentor, a social worker who was going to help them find their way through the system. Instead of this mentor telling them what they needed, they adopted this approach. What matters to you? What do you need? And they were surprised when they got responses like, well, what I need is a new pair of glasses, or a hearing aid, or a mobile phone that will help me try and contact my family. 18 months later, 11 out of the 13 were in permanent accommodation. Some were in employment, and the average spend across the £39,000 in the bank accounts was £780 per bank account. Give people options and a choice, and they will not let you down. But treat them like puppets. You're not going to get any positive result. Build trust and a sense of control and the ability to make choices. The Economist, in the light of the Broadway project, came up with this shaft of radical common sense. The most efficient way to spend money on the homeless might be to give it to them. Duh. The other thing about early child neglect and the Adverse Childhood Experiences study, they calculated that 1 year's worth of child neglect in the United States brings with it a lifetime cost to the American economy of $124 billion. Okay? So on a population-weighted basis, I calculated that that's 1 year's worth. 1960, the children born in 1960 by now will have cost the Scottish economy about £1.8 billion. And the children born in 1961 will have cost slightly less than that, and so on. The cost in terms of the fact that they don't work, the fact that a lot of them go to prison, the fact that a lot of them have serious health problems and so on, is enormous. This isn't, this makes sound financial sense to support people in difficulty because it saves money down the line. But apart from anything else, it's the right thing to do. What we need to move is from this box on the left, where we have a rational system that identifies problems, designs services to fix those problems, implements solutions by doing things to people rather than with them. It's run by and for professionals. We talk about clients, service users, and the whole purpose of the organisation is to be efficient and play it safe, don't get into trouble. We need to move to a system where we ask people, what's your definition of a good life? What do you need? What are the strengths you can bring to this? We need to build support and networks, and it gets run by the citizen who takes charge of his own life and pulls for support rather than has it pushed at him. And the purpose is to build social cohesion. I'll skip over that in the interest of time. Stoke-on-Trent did an interesting thing a few years ago. They used data to segment the population into those that were managing quite well, those that were struggling, and those that were frankly chaotic. They adopted this approach of asking people what matters to you, and they applied it across all the public sector agencies. And they saw immediately big changes. This is evictions from social housing, fell dramatically within a few months. They calculated that the year before they implemented this, that 1,000 people had cost the council over £100,000 each, mainly in terms of costs of social services, but costs to local authority housing as doors and windows got kicked in, costs to the health service, costs to the criminal justice system. The year after they implemented this, that £100,000 had fallen to just over £2,000 per person. Huge reductions in social work time, local authority time, health service time. Criminal justice time had almost disappeared. The only organisation that was spending more money was education, because more of the kids were going to school. It's a no-brainer. In Wolverhampton, where a police inspector said to his officers, what's stopping you helping people, doing the right thing for people? Well, it's all this bureaucracy. Right, forget the bureaucracy. I'll take responsibility for you forgetting it. Spend the time out there helping people, asking them what they need, and helping them get that. Total recorded crime fell 40% within 4 months. What we've got back here was the new public management era, performance management, where the focus was on organisations, efficiency. And that was about keeping power at the centre. What we have introduced in Scotland is a quality improvement approach, where we go out with our early years collaborative and so on, asking people to help frontline staff help design services with people that will help. And as a result, for example, infant mortality and stillbirth rate have both fallen by 15% in Scotland over the past 5 or 6 years. Where we need to move to is the social action area, where we cede power to people, to citizens who will help design services that they need, and co-production between the public sector. This man, Sir John Sinclair, who wrote the first statistical account of Scotland at the end of the 18th century, and was, I discover, the first person ever to use the word statistics in the English language, said, maybe what we should be doing is measuring happiness in our society and trying to understand the future means of its improvement. What a far-seeing individual, but that's us Scots, actually. We're all like that. To do that, we need to be courageous. We need to be prepared to break the rules. We need to get out there, get our feet wet, try things, and when things work by doing things differently, tell everyone about it. It's about the interaction between public sector and citizens, and stuff the rules. Get your feet wet, and if they get a bit muddy, what the hell? As long as we change lives for the better. Thanks very much.